Hi everyone, my name is Ana Valdivia. I am a lecturer in AI, Government and Policy here at the Oxford Internet Institute. And to everyone online and in the room, welcome to Studying Online Adoption Advocacy, the digital representation, monetisation, and transfer of children in the USA. We are delighted to have here Dr. Isabelle Higgins with us today to discuss how children, them eligible for adoption in the US, are represented and monetized by a range of digital adoption advocates, including governments, private adoption agencies, and adoptive parents. Dr. Isabelle Higgins is a teaching associate in media and culture and sociological theory at the Department of Sociology of the University of Cambridge. Isabelle is interested in studying empirical sites in which emerging forms of technology are made sense of and used by people in their everyday lives. She draws on a range of social theory to critically interrogate the power relations and expressions of social inequality that are reflected, refracted, reproduced, or challenged in such empirical locations. You have such a nice bio. I'm going to copy some of these slides.
Also, you don't have to read it all.
So for your awareness, this event is being recorded and we will post it on our website following the event. The presentation will run for about 40 minutes, followed by discussion at the end. If you're joining us online, please put your questions into the Q&A box at Zoom, and those in the room, save your questions until the end, and Isabelle will answer them after the talk. If you wish to ask questions with your microphone on, please raise your hand during the Q&A and we will call you on. Be aware that this will be included in the recording. It's great to have you here and the floor is yours, Isabelle.
Thank you so much, Anna, and thanks everyone. Hi, it's nice to see you all, meet you. Great, I think we'll just jump straight into it. So I'm going to begin with a blank slide and I'm going to read a little bit of autoethnography that I wrote at the end of spending a year observing these online practices by a range of what I call adoption advocates who are all doing different things on the internet. So I'll just read to start with. So when I close my eyes, I'm confronted with images of other people's children. I see children in palpable contexts of desperation, their eyes and bellies protruding, their faces turned up towards the camera. I see Black and white and East Asian children stood on well-manicured lawns in high order, wearing matching clothes, answering a roll call from an adult voice off camera. I see children entering and exiting churches, courthouses, schools. I see children laughing in hospital beds, children crying sprawled across shiny kitchens, children being fed through tubes, non-verbal children learning how to communicate with electronic devices, babies with bows on their heads lying on their backs and smiling, little Black girls with white women combing their hair, one little white girl with a Black woman combing hers. I see dead infants dressed in handcrafted crochet clothes. I see children who are very much alive, leaping, running, laughing, swimming, eating, dancing. I see children emerging into the world, their mothers squatting in birthing pools, the children's heads reflected through the water. I see parents speaking about their children, the children they have, the children they hope to have, how they hope to have these children. I see children staring at the camera, the words "adopt me from foster care" juxtaposed over their bodies. I see posts captioned "Waiting Child Wednesdays," in which children in institutional care centres in China look straight into the camera. I see children playing with toys, games, children of colour and their white mothers wearing matching clothes, images responded to by hundreds of thousands of viewers, images sponsored by well-known brands. My mind is full of images of other people's children. So that is where we begin. And here is a visual version of the same thing. So my research focuses on looking at a number of different sites where people are using the internet in their everyday lives to encourage the adoption of children into families in the US. So I began this work actually as an undergraduate student and continued it for my MPhil and my PhD. Do we have any MPhil students, master's students here? So yes, great. Good. So this paper is the only thing that's been kind of formally published so far from the PhD, and this was actually a reworking of my MPhil thesis. So what I started doing during the MPhil was looking at a number of different sites, so states run by the US government and by government agencies, and this was 2019 to 2022, I was doing this research, so looking at US government sites where children's personal information is shared in the public domain, looking also at sites run by private adoption agencies where children's personal information is shared. And then I would look at how the information from both of these websites gets shared and reshared on social media with the aim of getting images of particular children in front of prospective adoptive parents who might go on to adopt them. Now, crucially for this practice, many of the people who see these images haven't yet been deemed eligible to adopt, right, by the state. So they might see an image of a child online, and as a result of seeing that image and feeling that they want to adopt a particular child, go on to adopt. Lots of people who do adopt children in the US create videos that document core moments of that journey. So the moment where they first meet their adopted child, the child they're going to adopt, for example. And a very small number comparatively of these people or of other people who choose to adopt work as social media influencers, where one of the things that they monetize is the fact that they are a family with adopted children. So my PhD focused on all of these things. The MPhil just focused on this part. The PhD, I did more work because I also thought about all of the different types of digital texts and practices that were going on in all of these places. I tried to place this historically and thinking about long histories of settler colonialism and chattel enslavement in the US in particular. I also tried to think politically and economically on a global scale to think about why children were being moved from China to the US in a certain way, for example. And there was a lot of methodological and ethical reflections that came from this project, because ultimately all of this material focuses on images of children, and most of the children whose images are being used either aren't necessarily old enough to understand what that information is being used for online, and or even if they do understand, they might not have consented to it, right? So there are lots of complicated ethical questions the whole way through this. What I'm doing at the moment with this policy fellowship that I hold alongside my teaching role is to think about how all of this type of material is being used probably and collected as part of the training data for generative AI technologies. So hopefully this gives a sense of kind of, the question seems quite simple. How is the design and use of the internet affecting the adoption of children into families in the US? But the answer is very complicated. And the idea of the internet in this answer is very multifaceted. Good. Okay, so in terms of literature then, I aim to bring a variety of literature together in this project. There's a lot of really valuable work already done that looks at domestic and transnational adoption, both kind of ethnographically and political economically. There's lots of other really valuable scholarship or related scholarship that thinks about racial and reproductive injustice in the US or places the US in a global context of different forms of inequality. A third field thinks about social inequality encoded in and reproduced through everyday digital practice. This is a field that someone like Ruha Benjamin might refer to as race critical code studies, and other people talk about as critical race and digital studies. And I would say a fourth group of scholars, although there's obviously some overlap between all of these, think more kind of about the relationship between history and the present. How do we trace relations of power that emerged in a specific historic context that are still being re-expressed and re-articulated today? So what's really interesting is I have to draw on all of these bodies of literature in part because no one is really yet studying how the internet is changing the adoption of children into the US. So when I started this work, there were no publications like on that topic in particular, especially with regards to social media platforms. There've been some work on early internet blogs, but more recently that work just didn't exist. And so it felt like I had to draw from a breadth of places. The adoption literature also, for example, is often split so that some scholars think about adoption from within the US and some scholars think about transnational adoption where children are moved into the US. But again, that division didn't work for me because I was looking, for example, at social media influencers who might have adopted one child from within the US and one child from elsewhere. So the literature didn't necessarily reflect the data I was working with. And so I felt this need to draw on a number of different data types. I had a similar feeling when it came to methodology. So I would call what I did digital ethnography, in that I created social media profiles from which to follow a lot of these accounts. So at the end of spending a year of doing this, for example, I followed 74 adoptive parents who were working as social media influencers, and also based upon the recommended content that was fed to me by the algorithm from that account, I followed a number of other organizations concerned with adoption, a number of kind of brands that were very concerned with adoption. So a variety of different accounts, up to about 150. And I also went to the US for 6 months. I spent 6 months in the Library of Congress, and there I was looking at policy current policy to explain why all these practices were happening. Because when I present this work to people in the UK, they say, oh my goodness, data protection, GDPR. But obviously that doesn't exist in the US. So I wanted to get a sense of what the policy landscape was. And I also wanted to get a sense of relevant historic context. So the context that I found most relevant for this work was looking to the World's Fairs at the turn of the 20th century. Do people know about these World's Fairs? Great. So colonial administrators in the UK and France and the US decided to have these expositions where they would show the wonders of the world. And someone like the sociologist Julian Go makes the point that at the St. Louis World Fair, which I think was in 1903, there were what at the time were called living ethnological exhibits. So people who were experiencing colonization were literally physically moved and placed on display for others in attendance. And Go makes the point that that happened alongside the first meeting, the first Congress on Arts and Social Sciences. So his argument there is that there's always been this complex interplay between the disciplines that we work with and the marginalization of other peoples across the world and in our local areas too. So again, trying to bring all of this together, the most productive methodology I found was this methodology developed by Andre Brock called critical technocultural discourse analysis. I don't know if any of you are aware. No, okay, well, Brock says that we should study digital technologies as an assemblage of artifacts, practices, and cultural beliefs. So by that, he means that we need, as well as looking at a technological artifact, we have to pay attention to what people are doing with the artifact and the underlying cultural beliefs and values held by both the people enacting the practice and by the people who have designed the technology. And so he says that, you know, this approach allows us to think about a technology in context and think about how technology is actually being used. And I found that very, very productive. Brock makes the point too that CDTA is fundamentally perspectival, like you're always seeing things from where you're doing the research. And I found that very valuable too. And a big early part of this project was based on thinking about what it meant to do this research, right? Where the practice I was critiquing, the monetisation of children and the visual representation of children was ultimately something that I felt I was replicating or potentially could be replicating in my own research. And there are research ethics guidelines out there for internet research, but I really felt I had to do a lot of work in kind of working with them, thinking about them in practice in my particular context to make it make sense. Part of that involved thinking reflexively about the research. And when I use the word reflexive here, I'm thinking about reflexivity on multiple levels. I think Bourdieu and Wacon are really good on this in their book, An Introduction or an Invitation to Reflexive Sociology. So they argue that there are three types of reflexivity. There's the first they call the social origins and coordinates of the individual researcher. So I would reflect, for example, on how my own experience as a mixed race white British and Afro-Caribbean woman, who's obviously very white passing, how that shaped the research I was doing and why I might be interested in it. But I would also reflect on how my professional experience as someone who worked in campaigns and policy and with children who are experiencing multiple forms of marginalisation might shape my work. So that's the social origins and coordinates of me as an individual, but it's also helpful to think reflexively about what Bourdieu and Wacon called the academic field, which they define as the objective space of possible intellectual positions offered to us. So what do we think we can do as academics in this context? And that shapes, I think, what reflexive research is. And thirdly, they make the point that many researchers carry what they call this intellectualist bias, which invites us to consider the world as a spectacle. And that's a direct quote from them. And I find that incredibly productive because that is what I'm critiquing, but also partly what I'm doing, right? I'm looking at these images of children too. And so for that reason, I don't show any images of any children in any of my research outputs. And I'm going to show websites that are very easily accessible. You can just Google them and find them. But I always encourage people to think about what that Googling and finding is doing. If one of the points of this is to critique it, and the people who are creating these websites argue that they're valuable because people visit them, there's a question about what you visiting them on an individual basis is actually doing. And so open invitation for us all to think reflexively about how we relate to this research, basically. Okay, that's the preamble done. Good. Okay, so 4 theoretical starting points, and then we're going to get on to actually looking at some of the data. So 4 things I think it's really important to bear in mind. The first is about the origin of the child welfare system in the US. There are lots of amazing scholars who've written about different parts of this. Some of their books are screenshotted here. But Dorothy Roberts is really a seminal scholar in this area. And she, in 2022, came out with this book called Torn Apart. And this is a quote, not from the book, but from a shorter article she wrote about the book. So she makes the point that the US child welfare system, its origins lie in what she calls the forcible separation of enslaved families, the control of emancipated Black children as apprentices to former white enslavers, the mass removal of Indigenous children to be placed in boarding schools as an instrument of tribal genocide, and the shipping of European immigrant children on orphan trains to work on distant farms. The whole point of the child welfare system has always been to regulate economically and racially marginalised families. So the reason I find this so productive are lots of reasons. Firstly, she's very historically specific. And secondly, she's thinking very intersectionally, right, about how forms of inequality are related not only to racial identity, but to class identity and to location and to time period. And all of those things become relevant in this analysis. So there's a very general overview of where the adoption kind of industry in the US comes from. I begin with Roberts's work. In terms of thinking about digital technology, then, Ruha Benjamin, amongst other people, has been a big influence. And she has this wonderful quote from like an older paper of hers. She asks about digital technology, who and what is fixed in place, classified, corralled, and or coerced to enable innovation. And again, I think this is a super helpful starting point when we're thinking about marginality and its reproduction through technology. Saadia Hartman, this is a completely different text, Scenes of Subjection, which is a book about the 19th century US and racialized terror after the formal abolition of enslavement. This quote, when I read it, I felt there was so much resonance with my present research context, and we're not going to do much of the historic analysis in this presentation, but I think it's helpful to have this as framing. She's talking about kind of performances at the turn of the 20th century, and she says, what concerns me here is the diffusion of terror and the violence perpetrated under the rubric of pleasure, paternalism, and property. And that pleasure, paternalism, and property, again, I think we're going to see over and over. But again, you may disagree. And finally, this quote from Hauser reminds us that as academic researchers and thinkers, we're developing this critical consciousness that is always in progress. And so I always feel that my relationship to this work and to the complexity of this work changes all of the time. And my feelings about the work change too. And so always really welcome feedback and thoughts. Great. Okay, so now we're going to do the look at the data. So we're going to think about 2 types of online locations. So from this, we're kind of only going to think about 2. So we're going to think about websites designed to make children visible. And then we're going to think about social media posts created by a range of adoption advocates. Okay, so how are people at the back? Can you see these? Can you see the words, or can you just kind of see the boxes?
The boxes.
Boxes. Okay, thank you. Okay, so we'll start with these. These are screenshots from my New Media and Society paper, so you can find them if you'd like to see them in more detail. So this is a screenshot of a database that's funded by the US federal government. And at the time of doing this research, there were over 5,000 children in this database. Now it's fewer, it's more about 3,500 last time I checked. So here, when you enter the website, the viewer is presented with an interface where you can choose the gender, the number of children you might be interested in adopting, their age. Racial composition is the phrasing that they use. And depending if you click do not search based on race or search based on a single or multiracial, you get a number of racial categorizations that you can click on. And then you can search particular geographic locations, children with Spanish skills, and then you click search. This interface is no longer online, but this is one of the most egregious, which is why it's in here to give everyone a sense. So here, in addition to all of those categories, you can also choose special needs, what they call special needs related to a child. So, and they define these as emotional, physical, developmental, and learning. And the options are mild, moderate, or severe. Now, so this is a state interface. Most states in the US have at least one of these interfaces that exists. Some states have 2 or 3. And the number of children in these interfaces vary. And there can be as few as 13 children in one state interface I looked at, up to hundreds of children in a different one. And so, as well as choosing special needs, and many of the state interfaces have that choice, This state interface for a time also had the option to include or exclude children who had been sexually abused, drug exposed or affected, or had issues with bladder and bowel control. Now, once the user clicks search on these websites, what they tend to be presented with is photographs, first names and descriptions of individual children currently living in state care. And so this is obviously a very complicated practice and one that I critique strongly for a number of reasons. So the first reason that I would critique it is because for many, these children have been deemed eligible for adoption, but actually only 16% of children removed from their families by US state agencies have been done so on the basis of physical or sexual abuse. And one of the most common reasons that children are removed is in relation to this broad definition of neglect, which a scholar like Laura Briggs, a reproductive scholar and historian, she defines or she refers to neglect as what could otherwise be called simply the bad luck of being poor, right? So things like not having appropriate access to housing, food, healthcare, clothing can be enough for state agencies to remove a child. And once children are removed, the state can decide that the parents, the birth parents, family or community are not deemed fit enough to have those children removed, returned to them, and then their parental rights can be terminated. So it isn't necessarily the case that these children don't have parents or community who want to care for them. It's that the state has decided that the parents are not fit to care for them. And as many scholars point out, this is a deeply racialized process, and it's racialized on multiple levels. And I can go into that more in the Q&A. But the ACLU of Northern California, just as one statistic, make the point that over 50% of Black children in the US will experience a child welfare investigation by age 18. So that doesn't mean that they're going to be removed, it means that there's going to be an investigation, and nearly 10% will be removed from their parents and placed into foster care. Now, what is important about this is that not all children who are placed into foster care and whose parental rights have been terminated are placed on these websites. It is only children who are deemed as special needs. And this special needs characterization is intensely racialized. So in 1996, a piece of federal legislation was passed that meant that a Black child on the basis of their racial identity was classed as special needs. And that special needs designation meant that the year that adoptive parents adopted that child, the parents would be afforded a $6,000 tax break because they were adopting a special needs child. Now, today it's a little bit more complicated, but in Florida, adopting a Black or mixed race child, they automatically count as special needs. In Massachusetts, older children are counted as special needs, but the age at which a child is deemed older is racialized. So white children are counted as special needs once they're 8, and Black children are counted as special needs once they're 2. So again, we see this 6-year difference. And still, tax breaks are offered to parents adopting special needs children. In 2024, the amount of the tax break was over $16,000. So there's an economic valuation going on here. And crucially, it is only children who are special needs whose information is put on these websites. So it is the children who are least in demand within the current adoption system who are put on these websites. The privacy questions are obviously another huge one. Very few of the websites have this kind of privacy notice. So this one says, many of the children who've been removed from their homes due to neglect, physical or sexual abuse, emotional abuse, and or the inability of their parents to care adequately from them. These children live in our communities. If you recognise any of them, please respect their privacy. This photo listing is a very effective tool for finding families for our waiting children. Unfortunately, it also makes the children vulnerable to negative intrusions into their lives. Please help us to protect them. And now many of the sites don't have this kind of notice. This site does, but it's immediately followed by a browse and a search button, which somewhat complicate the kind of claim for privacy that they're making here. Obviously, depending on people might say that this is a risk, but these sites create a risk of harm for children, or that these sites are a type of harm already. And that's something I'd be interested to debate, that difference between risk and harm. Just a few things that I think about in my work, for example, what happens if children in one of these in a child's school know that the child is in foster care and are able to locate them on one of these websites? what happens if the child had experienced domestic abuse in their home environment and whoever was abusing them was able to relocate them through these websites. The questions kind of go on and on in terms of the types of harm. So that's kind of, yeah, website type 1 of making children visible. Now, I don't actually have screenshots of these second types, so domestic adoption agency websites or transnational websites. But the point here is that the transnational websites, so those profiling children outside of the US, often in global majority contexts, quite often have even less protections than these websites. So I'll read here just a tiny bit of autoethnography, which was me trying to find out what the privacy protections were on the websites for children not in the US. So I say I Googled, and it was just 2 words to describe these websites, and found on the first page of search results a site from an agency run in a US state who focus on adoptions from a country in Eastern Europe. So that's children profiled in Eastern Europe to be adopted into the US. Does that make sense? Good, thank you. I clicked on this site and was directed to a page with photographs of children, each captioned with a name and the statement updated on this date, available until this date. When hovering my cursor over the image of each child's face, a short statement about their physical disabilities appears, along with the statement, to learn more, text us at this phone number. Clicking on the Learn More button under each image, I am met with significant medical detail about each child, including their medical diagnoses, their motor development, personal development, and emotional development and playing skills. Some of the statements on this website caused me to pause, feeling physically disturbed by the level of detail they contain. I showed some of these websites to a friend of mine who was a doctor, and we had a discussion about how these websites read very much like medical records. So we're seeing this huge amount of information sharing happening. Now, this is all happening, and in addition to this, we're also seeing websites where potential birth parents are being profiled. So I'm going to read another, this is a description. These are composite descriptions, okay? So other websites, what they do is they'll be run by a private adoption agency who is trying to encourage a pregnant person in the US to place their child at, when it's born, with an adoptive family. And these adoptions are private, so they tend to cost around £30,000, but the cost can vary depending on the child that's being adopted. So children who are more in demand tend to cost more to adopt. So during pregnancy, if a birth parent decides or a birth mother decides to place her child when it's born with an adoptive family, some of her housing and healthcare costs can be covered by that adoptive family. And one website I found profiled both prospective birth parents, so people who are pregnant, who are thinking about placing their child when it's born for adoption, and also self-authored, what they're called profile books, created by potential adoptive families that contain photographs and descriptions of the family. And these books are given to potential birth parents so they can choose who they would like to adopt their child. So it's kind of facilitating this child transfer. So I'm going to read out a listing. I'm going to read out a description of a birth mother from this site, and then a description of a potential adoptive parent from the same site. So listing 1 is of the birth parent. And so they tend to read something like this. This expectant mother's due date is in this time, and she lives in this place. Her baby's race will be this. The mother reports that there has been no drug use during pregnancy. She will need assistance with housing costs for the remaining duration of her pregnancy. She is open to any family of any race who can give her child the life it deserves. And that last line is often different. So she would like an African-American family for her child. She would like a family that is Christian. She would like. And in contrast, here's an opening statement from a profile book created by a potential adoptive family. Dear birth mother, thank you for taking such a brave and loving step towards placing your child with a warm and caring family. Hopefully we are that family. So can you see the difference there in the way in which not only people are described, but the power given for self-description, right? So birth parents, potential birth parents are described in the third person, and their identity is reduced to characteristics that may be of interest to someone who would like to adopt their child. Whereas potential adoptive parents have this capacity for self-authorship and for the creation of a much more textured, multi-layered description of who they are. And this all exists on the same website. So some states have responded to these some of this complexity. So actually in 2024, Florida passed a piece of legislation in relation to these sites that said that children over 12 should be in state care, should have their consent sought about their descriptions on these websites, and also their consent sought for the image that is used. And that, you know, I think does something, but the much deeper structural questions here I don't think are addressed by a piece of legislation like that. Okay, moving on then to think about social media posts and practices. So there are lots of different posts and practices, and I just wanted to highlight 3. So the first types of post and practice that I saw a lot on social media when I was doing this research are matching posts. So this is when an adoption agency will create content that says, you know, here is a photograph of this child, they are this age, they like or dislike this thing, please like and share and comment on this photograph to help find a family for the child. And so a question we need to think about there is kind of, if someone is scrolling through their social media and they're seeing content about all sorts of things, and they're seeing targeted advertisements, oh, there's a nice handbag I would like to buy, these are other things I'm interested in, and then the next thing they see is a child that's looking for a home, right? Lots of scholars have written about context collapse on social media, which is why it can feel so strange to be on one social media platform and see updates from like your boss, your ex-partner from when you were a teenager, and your current mother-in-law, for example. That can be a strange experience. But the question is, how much is this context collapse extending if we're seeing the image for a product we might like to buy and then an image for a child that we might like to adopt, one after the other? I think there's a deep ethical question there that we should be grappling with. Something else that's happening is this targeting of birth parents or potential birth parents, which concerns me. So looks like a kind of standard infographic, right? But the text reads, adoption. If a baby is not a blessing for you right now, let them be a blessing to someone else. Just thinking about this in the context of the US, where the Dobbs v. Jackson decision in 2022 effectively stopped abortion being an option for lots of people. What does this kind of content do to someone who is struggling to make really serious reproductive choices and doesn't have the options open to them that they were hoping to have? Another thing that I saw happening is potential adoptive parents using the capacities of social media, particularly hashtags, to locate potential birth parents directly, and thereby bypassing the kind of intermediary adoption agency that would have held that role in the past. And that bypassing, I think, is really important too, because there are some protections for potential birth parents. So officially, well, parents can't be paid to place a child for adoption, like a pregnant person can't be paid for that. But the question is if there is no now regulation of that process, what is going on and how do we even know? So they're the matching posts. There are 2 other types of posts. I'm going to skip over the Gotcha Day posts, but in short, these are posts that are created when adoptive families who are adopting transnationally go to meet the child that they might want to adopt in its country of origin and then bring the child back to the US. And this phrase Gotcha Day has already been critiqued by adoption scholars. So Bashidou here says public ceremonies and new rites of passage, such as the Gotcha Day, project an impression of children as commodities to be exchanged. And what I do in my New Media and Society paper is both talk about the colonial history of this phrase, Gotcha Day, quite literally got you day, right? But also talk about how YouTube, the capacities of YouTube and the interface of YouTube, where you can search for Gotcha Day and see hundreds of these videos, is creating a site for collective memory making, in which a certain type of affective response to this content is encouraged in viewers. And the final thing I think about, and this is work forthcoming, is I look particularly at social media influencers who are adoptive parents, and almost exclusively white women with adopted children of colour. And so there are big questions here. Some of them more broadly connect to these debates about child influences, which are being talked about in a number of places, whether these children should be seen as conducting a form of labour, whether it's right for childhoods to be commodified and for privacy to be denied in such a way. But I'm also really interested in thinking about how intersectional forms of identity are being commodified in these practices. And especially in the moment that we're in, I would say from, well, the time that I was doing this research, 2019 to 2022, we see a different way in which people's individual identities are being commodified and engaged with, not always for purposes of social liberation. And I'm reminded of Patricia Hill Collins here, who even back in 1998 wrote about us existing within a distributive paradigm of social justice, where a person can be, and I'm quoting now, distilled to his or her image and exchanged on a marketplace of ideas. And I think there's something of that type going on in some of this content creation. Crucially, all of these types of content creation are engaged with by large audiences. Some of the Gotcha Day videos, for example, have views in the millions or the high hundreds of thousands, and the majority of comments existing on this content is incredibly positive. Some adoptive parent social media influencers, have PO boxes where their audiences will send them toys and gifts for the children in their care. So there is genuine widespread support for these practices. Okay, so to end then, how are we for time? Good, about right. So going back to Andre Brack and his argument that we should be studying technologies as an assemblage of artifacts, practices, and cultural beliefs, hopefully after going through some of the material, this makes a little bit more sense. So the artifacts that I'm looking at here might be a single Instagram post created by an adoptive parent influencer. It might be a single post of a child on one of these websites, or it might be the website itself, right? But this post is in context, it exists on a particular social media site in relation to particular algorithmic technologies and particular options to like and share, for example. But the artifact is also the phone that people are using to engage with this content and the children in question. So we can think about artifacts on multiple levels. Similarly, what practices are going on here? Adoption advocacy is a shorthand that I use, but really what we're looking at is the aim of placing children with families in America who've been deemed eligible to adopt, the monetization or digital labor related to those practices, digital practices that are intimately connected to physical movement, and audience practices too. And there are a set of beliefs going on. The obvious belief is that adoption is a solution. And sometimes this is religiously motivated. So some people in this space who are openly evangelical Christian will talk about an idea of the global orphan crisis that their Christian faith encourages them to respond to. But there's also a lot of non-religious beliefs that motivate these practices. These culture of poverty discourses that come from the 1970s, neoliberal ideology and the demonization of Black mothers and their children also really do animate and move around in these spaces. I think all of this is driven by market forces, and there's also a deep level of colorblind ideology, so people often not speaking about or writing about race or addressing racial inequality, and yet racial inequality being key to these practices. And so I think CDTA takes us very far. I think there are a number of other things that are really important to think about, including histories, material and embodied relations that we can't see online, and kind of affective and emotional registers, which I didn't spend that much time looking at in my PhD, but I'm keen to come back to now I'm done. And I'll stop there. So yeah, currently thinking about policy implications, how US policy could be challenged in relation to the use of all of this image in generative AI. I'm working with a colleague at LSE, Suzanne Harris, and we just wrote this blog. She's doing work on NGO sponsorship so we're thinking together about globally how children's bodies are being rendered a form of digital commodity. So it's been really productive to bring our work together. And then I've been trying to do a few different things. So set up a research cluster in Cambridge on sociology, film and visual art. And I've been working with a visual artist on this film project for the last 2 years, which has been really fun. And it's good, I think, to do something that reminds me of kind of the effective textured agency held by people who use social media, as well as kind of the depths of inequality that social media can perpetuate. And I'm also developing some of the theoretical elements of this work a bit more at the moment, which is exciting too. And there's a bibliography in case anyone wants any references. And that's it. Thank you very much.